Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you here for another fantastic webinar with ETS Laboratories. My name is Madison Garzoli, and I'm the Director of Membership and International Programs. I am so delighted to have Dr. Rich DiCenzo with us. He is going to be talking all things cellar sanitization. And before we begin, I just wanted to address a few housekeeping items. Number one, this webinar is recording, and we will be sending this out via email as well as including it on our SCION playlist on YouTube. The second item is if you have any questions or comments, please direct them to the chat. Rich has indicated that he's open to answering them during the presentation, so I'll be jumping in and vocalizing any questions in the chat. So please direct them there. And this is going to be a very thorough presentation, and we're so excited to have Rich here virtually, although we wish it was in person, but doing the best that we can right now, and hopefully this will get you and your team prepared for what's to come in Harvest 2021. So Rich, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Madison. Thanks for inviting me to speak here. I always enjoy talking with the members of Sonoma County Vintners. So for everyone joining today, thanks for taking time out of your day. Madison had explained to me that the membership really wanted a seminar on winery sanitation. Usually Bob Tracy and I, Bob from BevTrack and I kind of tag team and do a seminar together, but Bob has, he's very busy right now, had other obligations today. So I'm going to do a seminar which is primarily from my viewpoint, but also Bob provided me a couple of slides that I'll use just to show some case studies. With that, we'll get started. I think that the primary goal of this seminar is, or I should say the focus of this seminar is for people maybe newer to the industry, certainly for the cellar crews to get an overview of why sanitation is important, although they probably mostly know that, but we're going to repeat it again today. And we're going to go through some topics that are involved with both sanitation and microbiology. So with that, we'll go ahead and start. Let's see if we can make this work. So I always start off a slide saying, winemaking is managing a biological process, okay? Conversion of grape juice to wine involves both yeast and bacteria. It's biology. It'll happen even if you don't do anything. If you just crush grapes and leave them in a bucket, you'll make wine. Of course, it might not be very good because there's a lot of different microbes in there. What we try to do in the wine industry is we try to support or encourage the good microbes to do the job that we want. Whether it's fermentation and then malolactic fermentation, and we try to discourage or prevent the spoilage microbes from doing what they want to do. And so that's the biological process. We essentially just shepherd the microbes through the process. And, people will say, well, why is winery sanitation so important? And the number one reason is to control the growth of microbes that can cause wine spoilage. I mean, this is the whole point. We start out with a certain potential when we harvest the grape, and there's a lot of science and knowledge that goes into that decision of when we pick the grape, and at that point you have the maximum potential for wine. And then we go through the winemaking process, and all the way from the very beginning until it goes into the bottle, and even after that, there are potential places where we can potentially have spoilage occur. And so we need to maintain sanitation to prevent those microbes from having the opportunity to spoil the wine. Okay, another reason, although I'm not going to really touch on it today, the focus of today's talk is going to be controlling the growth of microbes that can cause wine spoilage, but also compliance with the Food Safety Modernization Act guidelines. As you know, the FDA can come in and inspect your winery now, and it's all about sanitation. Okay, so but that's another topic. Today we're going to just focus on microbes and sanitation. So what kind of spoilage can occur by uncontrolled growth of spoilage yeast and bacteria? So this is just a rundown. I think many of these you're familiar with, some maybe you haven't seen before, but these are all problems caused by microbes. So the first one is acetic acid. Okay, I'm going to talk about. And acetic acid is vinegar. Okay, volatile acidity. All right, that's what we call it. In my opinion, this is the most prevalent spoilage problem in the industry. And I can say that because there's at least 5 companies, I believe, in the North Coast area that do VA removal. Okay, they do acetic acid removal either by reverse osmosis or spinning cone technology. But these companies are booked out weeks and sometimes months in advance. So they're driving constantly on the road, going to wineries, removing VA. So VA is a big problem. And the thing is, it's really probably the easiest to prevent, but nonetheless, it's a big problem. The odor threshold for acetic acid, at least what's published, is about 0.9 grams per liter. And of course, that's dependent upon the wine style. A lighter wine, 0.9 might be very noticeable. In a really big wine, it might not be as noticeable. Certainly right after fermentation, when you have all these fermentation aromas, you might not notice it so much. But that's roughly the threshold or the published threshold. Of course, the legal limits for acetic acid in wines is, I think it's 1.4 grams per liter in red wines and 1.2 grams per liter in white wines. And so the idea is not to have spoilage that would detract from the wine, or levels that would detract from the wine, but also not to have levels that will exceed TTD regulation, so you can't sell the wine. The source of acetic acid are yeast, acetic acid bacteria, heterofermented lactic acid bacteria, and there's even some cases we've documented where being overzealous, if you will, with SO2 gas when you're storing barrels can actually create a scenario where you can create high levels of VA in the barrel. So a lot of ways to make it, but once again, a big problem. And that's one of the ones we're going to try to prevent with sanitation. Another one is ethyl acetate, and that's got sort of a solvent or a nail polish remover type aroma. That's something that the odor threshold's around 150 parts per million or milligrams per liter. At that level where you're just starting to detect it, it might be a little bit fruity and maybe not seem like a bad thing, but as it gets up higher, it's going to have that definite solvent type aroma. Generally the source is from non-Saccharomyces yeast or in cold soap. We see a lot of it there. Acetic acid bacteria can also produce it. And then there's possibility of some spontaneous chemical formation. Ethyl acetate is really a combination of acetic acid up here and ethanol here. And with just a little bit of acid, you can create it from those 2 individual compounds. So if you have high levels of acetic acid in your wine, it's likely that you can form some ethyl acetate just spontaneously. Another one which you've probably all heard of is 4-EP, 4-EG, or 4-ethylphenol and 4-ethylguaiacol. These are volatile compounds, markers that have aromas like Band-Aid or phenol or barnyard or leather. And the odor threshold for these is around 400 parts per billion or micrograms per liter for 4-EP, and around 50 parts per billion or micrograms per liter for 4-EG. Okay, and of course these are byproducts or metabolites of Brettanomyces, and that's something that if you ever tasted a wine or had wines in your facility that have Brettanomyces, these are part of that aroma complex that you're smelling. But these are the markers we use to determine if it's present or not. Mousy, this is one a lot of people haven't been exposed to. There's 3 compounds that are responsible for this. These are the names of them. I won't bother you with them as far as pronouncing them, but they're all essentially pyridine type compounds. And they've got a very interesting way of presenting themselves in that you don't smell them initially. Because at wine pH, they are not volatile, but as they interact with the saliva in your mouth and the pH of the wine goes up in your mouth, all of a sudden these are released. So when you first sip the wine, you don't really notice this unless it's extraordinarily high levels. But for the most cases, you don't notice it. And then maybe 30 seconds to a minute after you've tasted the wine, you start getting this sensation kind of at the back of your throat or the roof of your mouth in the back, almost like someone's rubbed a greasy Fritos corn chip there. Some people say it tastes just like basmati rice. Others say it smells like a hamster cage. But bottom line, these are things that we're detecting in the part per billion range, and some of them at very low part per billion range. And these are produced by primarily lactic acid bacteria. The literature seems to suggest that Brettanomyces can do this, but most of the time when we've seen this in wines, it's associated with the presence of lactic acid bacteria. Okay, and so once again, it's once you taste it, you'll never forget it. Okay, and it's not something pleasant in wine. Another one, diacetyl, another spoilage compound. I say to butter or not to butter. Diacetyl is a buttery aroma, and it tastes like, smells like butter or buttered popcorn. The detection threshold is around 2 to 3 ppm or parts per million, and this is from lactic acid bacteria. And the thing is, in white wines, some people, they like the, say in a big North Coast Chardonnay, they want some vanilla from oak and they want some butter. And so in some cases, people will try and achieve diacetyl production for a particular style. But certainly in red wines and in many wines, it's considered a fault. And once again, spoilage caused by lactic acid bacteria. So the next one, biogenic amines. This is one that's not on a lot of people's radar, but it's found in most wines that have had any growth of bacteria. And this is simply the bacteria take amino acids, and there's always amino acids in wine, and they convert them to these compounds called putrescine and cadaverine, histamine and tyramine. So at high levels, you can get aromas of fermented meat like salami, rotten fish. With high levels of putrescine, you can get a metallic taste. But what's even, I think, a bigger problem is that moderate levels, you get a muted aroma where it just seems to knock down the aroma in the wine. And you may look at the tasting notes and say, well, this was actually, the wine seems to be diminished from what it was. Okay, so certainly this is something that occurs in wines. The detection threshold may be 50 to 100 ppm. Pediococcus is probably the most prevalent producer, and in any wine that has high levels of Pediococcus, which means most high pH wines, you'll find these biogenic amines. They used to be regulated. Certainly Switzerland had import limits, so if your wine had more than, say, 10 ppm of histamine, they'd reject the wine. So that could cost you some money if you were trying to export wine into Switzerland. I've got a couple more of these. Acrolein. Acrolein, once again, is a compound of extreme bitterness. And I mean, when you have just a little bit, the wine is bitter, but if you get a wine that has a lot of it, it's really horrible, and it's a building sensation. It gets more and more bitter, and you have to go eat cheese or something just to get rid of the bitterness. It's really, if you taste this, it's pretty bad. The detection threshold's around 10 parts per million, and it's a metabolic byproduct from lactobacillus or other lactic acid bacteria. where they're metabolizing glycerol. And the thing is, acrolein itself is not really bitter, but it interacts with phenolics in the wine, and that's produces that highly bitter compound. And the last one we'll talk about is briefly is acetaldehyde. And everyone has smelled acetaldehyde because when a wine is oxidized, you smell that acetaldehyde. It smells like a sherry or bruised apples, overripe apples. And the odor threshold's probably around 100 ppm. And this can come from yeast, from acetic acid bacteria, and just oxidation of ethanol. But certainly microbes can produce this. And one of the problems with acetaldehyde is it scavenges up free SO2. So 1 milligram per liter of acetaldehyde will bind up like 1.45 milligrams per liter of SO2. So if you're adding free SO2 or adding SO2 to the wine and your free SO2 isn't going up, it's most likely in a finished wine because it's binding to this compound here. So once again, these are all things we want to prevent from occurring, okay? But the bottom line, by the time you can taste or smell spoilage, it's too late. Okay, and then you either have to downgrade the wine if you're a large facility to a lower price tier. You can remediate the wine, try to remove the problem. In some cases, some of these can be remediated, others cannot. So then you either have to sell the wine as bulk or use it in a second or third label, but it all means a cost or a loss of money. And that's probably one of the most important things I want to mention is that when you have wine spoilage, if it's before bottling, you generally have costly remediation, lower revenue because you're paying for remediation or you're getting less money for the wine. And that can translate into fewer employees. And I'm just putting this in very black and white terms here because you know what? If you're making less money, it's hard to keep employees on the payroll. After bottling, so if you don't catch it and it gets in the bottle or it occurs in the bottle, then you get bad reviews, you get a loss of customers, you get reduced sales, once again, lower revenue and fewer employees. So why is winery sanitation important? So the company you work for can be profitable and can continue to employ you. So that's the bottom line, okay? So now we'll talk about winery sanitation because that's just that's about the spoilage that can occur. And the bottom line is it's all about biofilms, okay? We're trying to clean and sanitize because there are biofilms everywhere in the winery, all right? These are complex communities of live and dead microbes. And, you know, you got bacteria and yeast that are in the wine and they manage to attach to a surface, the inside of a tank, a filter housing, whatever, and then they grow and they produce, all microbes produce these sort of polysaccharide protein exterior matrix, and then they're protected and they grow underneath there. And if you just wash this, you're not going to remove them. And then at some point they break open and they can release microbes, and this is where we get contamination down the road from. So biofilms are a huge problem. This slide just shows some different microbes, all grown in wine on a stainless steel plates here. And this is the air-liquid interface, and you can see that some of these microbes just form, and this is a stain for biofilm, so you can see them. So you can see that in some of these organisms, they only grow at the air-liquid interface, and that'd be something like, say, Acetobacter. But other organisms can proliferate all the way through the wine and the submerged surface. And so anytime you're looking at a stainless steel part and you see that it doesn't look clean, but it's not something that just rinses off, that's usually a biofilm of some type. So we need to get rid of biofilms for sanitation. So, you know, we talk about cleaning and sanitizing, and essentially those are both part of winery sanitation, and we need to do both of them. And so effective sanitation is essentially a four-step process. So, you know, those of you who work in the cellar know that, you know, first you have to rinse off all of the soil that can be removed easily, okay? And so we use warm water, better to use hot water, okay? So you can rinse off things. Then you've got to clean them. So you have to actually remove the debris. So wines, juice, tartrates, fruit, whatever's there. And you do that with either manually by scrubbing, or you can use mechanical, like spraying, like a gamma jet or something like that. And use detergent cleaners to penetrate and dislodge and carry away. And that's what detergents do. They penetrate into that soil or debris, they dislodge it, and then they keep it in suspension so they can carry it away when you rinse. And so then you have to rinse all that stuff, get rid of all the residual debris and cleaning chemicals. And finally, after it's clean, then you sanitize. And once equipment is clean, you use sanitizers to kill the microbes. It's important to remember that sanitizers by themselves do not effectively remove dirt, debris, and soil. So you have to clean first before you can sanitize. And people say, oh, do I really have to clean before sanitizing? And so there's a trigger warning here. If you don't like snakes, don't look at the next part of the slide. But you have to clean before sanitizing because you got to get rid of the cover. All right. If you've ever lifted up a rock or a log and had a snake underneath it, you know what I mean here. So basically, you can't get at the snake, or you can't sanitize until you remove the dirt. So we got to remove the rock before we can get rid of the snake. And I'm not advocating doing anything to snakes. I like snakes as long as I can see them. I like them. I don't like them to surprise me. But anyways, so we really need to clean thoroughly before we can have effective sanitation. So time is one of the major factors influencing the cleaning effectiveness. So the increased cleaner contact time, the greater amount of soil. Another thing with cleaners is that, or sanitizers, the same thing, increased sanitizer contact time, greater microbe killing power. So it makes sense, but the longer these compounds are in contact, the better they're going to do a job. If you just put it on there and rinse it off right away, it's not going to be as effective. So it takes time to clean and sanitize. Temperature is a big component. Typically, increased temperature leads to improved cleaning power. And so we're always trying to use hot water when possible. I've talked to people who work at wineries. There was one winery where they had no hot water. And I was astounded that in this day and age, there was a winery with no hot water. Everything was cold water. And I will tell you, they had huge problems with microbes, okay? Terrible sanitation problems. And so, matter of fact, I think wines from that facility had the highest levels of biogenic amines I've ever seen. So anyways, hot water, the hotter the better for cleaning. This says that the detergent soil reaction rate doubles with every 8 to 10 degree temperature increase. So the hottest water you can use is important for cleaning. Okay, we do have to be careful when using sanitizers, because some sanitizers work. They have a temperature range where they're effective, and if you go too high, they don't work. But for cleaning, once again, always follow the manufacturer's recommendations, but generally the hotter the temperature, the better. Chemical concentration, we always like to think more is better, but not always, okay? But it's important, once again, to follow the manufacturer's guidelines for your type of cleaner or sanitizer you're using. And it's not just the concentration, but all the type of cleaner you're using really depends on the type of soil, if it's organic or inorganic, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Okay, using a concentrated form of cleaner or sanitizer is not necessarily better. Okay, although we did say that if it's more concentrated, it may work a little bit faster. But the point is there's a trade-off of cost, because these things are not inexpensive. So once again, I always say follow the manufacturer's guidelines. Don't think if they say use it at one concentration, say at a 5%, don't think that 20% is going to be 4 times better. It'll be 4 times more expensive, but not necessarily 4 times better. And once again, as you increase time and temperature, generally you can reduce the concentration that you're using, because time and temperature are the longer time and higher temperature, generally the better things work. And once again, you can reduce costs if you have the ability to use really hot water and allow things to clean longer. Lastly, mechanical force. Simple hand scrubbing with a brush mechanical scrubbing, using high pressure. These are all things that are really important because mechanical force helps remove the soil or the dirt or the biofilms, and it certainly reduces time, temperature, and concentration requirements. So if you've got people who are skilled and know how to clean and know how to scrub, you can get things done quicker and maybe with lower temperatures and lower concentrations of your cleaning and sanitizing agents. So mechanical force is important. So what are some of the cleaners that we use in the industry? So certainly acid cleaners are important. And probably most of them are phosphoric. Nitric acid used to be widely used in Europe, and some of the formulations nowadays have some nitric in them, but nitric is a bit more expensive. So they have acid cleaners, and acid cleaners usually work well on greases and inorganic soils. Caustic or alkaline cleaners are generally used on organic soils. And then, if you get high pressure, gamma jets, things like that for that mechanical process. And then we start getting into what we call the blends. And these are things where it's acid or caustic cleaner with other things added to enhance the cleaning power. So the sodium percarbonate, the sodium hydroxide, sodium percarbonate cleaners, sodium carbonate and sodium percarbonate. There's all these different mixtures. And once again, depending on the type of soil that you have, with the type of stain or biofilm you have, some of these will work better than others. And once again, that's all up to the manufacturers. You should work very closely with the manufacturer or the provider of these, okay? Because those are the people who know what they work best with. When you're using these, as I said, generally it's not just a caustic. There are other things added that these blends, and they usually include a water softener, because you need to remove mineral ions. If you have really hard water, the cleaners are not as effective. So you have to remove mineral ions. So you either use sequestering agents like polyphosphates or chelating agents like EDTA. These remove mineral ions, and they help or increase the efficiency of the cleaner. You need wetting agents, so they lower the surface tension of the water so it spreads easier, so it doesn't beat up. And then they need to have dissolving ability. So these are all generally additives that are blended in, and that helps the detergent solubilize or dissolve the soil. And then finally, emulsification, breaking down fats and oils and dispersing them into solution. The whole idea of the cleaner is to break it down and then lift it up and hold it in the cleaning solution. And you can tell if you've got a surface and it's not clean, and you add just something that doesn't have all these different agents in it, it'll bead up. But if your cleaning agent is working well, compatible with your water and doing its job, it shouldn't be beating up. It should be nice and spread out on the surface, say the stainless steel. But once again, these are things that are generally blended in. You don't necessarily think about it or see about it, but it's in the blend that you're buying for a particular type of cleaner. So sanitizing, well, that's different. Now, okay, we've cleaned and now we want to kill, all right? And chlorine dioxide is a great sanitizer. It's not to be confused with bleach, okay? Sodium hypochlorite. Chlorine dioxide does not represent any type of risk in regards to TCA formation, okay? There's been extensive studies done, and chlorine dioxide does not contribute to TCA, so that's not an issue. And it's a very effective sanitizer, okay? It is expensive in that you have to usually at the winery level get a chlorine dioxide generator in place to produce it, but it's very effective. Hot water, the hotter the water, the better. Steam is great for killing microbes, okay? You poach them and they're gone. It works really well. People do use iodophores, iodine type solutions, certainly to clean utensils that are used in the winery, thieves, things like that. Ozone is widely used. It is very effective on non-porous surfaces like stainless steel. It works great. Peroxyacetic acid, once again, this generates a radical oxygen, and generally it's hydrogen peroxide is produced, and that is lethal to yeast and bacteria. The quaternary ammonia compounds, or quats, are very effective. They're good on winery surfaces because they have some protective power. Okay, they're able to prevent things from growing after the fact. So they've got a little bit of protective power. Sulfur dioxide, SO2, if you get a high enough molecular SO2, that will kill microbes, but it's got to be much higher than you'd ever have in a wine. So we talk about acidulated SO2, and usually it's a citric acid SO2 solution that are used. And once again, at high enough levels of molecular SO2, you can kill microbes. So once again, these are the sanitizers we would suggest using. Important things to remember when using the sanitizer is always verify the concentration of the sanitizer before you use it. In some cases, some of these have shelf lives. In some cases, they've got methods to test them, test strips to see if they're effective, but always verify the concentration of the sanitizer before you use it. When you're using hot water or steam, verify temperature on the equipment. So you want to make sure that the equipment is getting hot enough from the steam or hot water to sterilize. A lot of the sanitizers, as I mentioned earlier, these sanitizing agents are not compatible with higher temperatures, in some cases even with light. So you need to protect them and once again verify them before you use them, and avoid long storage times. Especially once you dilute them, they generally have a very short shelf life. Okay. So how do you monitor the effectiveness of cleaning and sanitation practices? The very first one is sensory inspection. You overall picture, you look at it. Does it look clean? Okay, do I see any biofilm in there? Is there any staining? Did I miss some parts? Or is it overall not that shine I expect from my stainless steel surfaces or whatever surfaces? You have to look at it. You can do ATP testing. This is the bioluminescence, and that detects the presence of organic matter. You can do swabbing and culturing of microbes. That measures the actual biological load on the surfaces. And then some people, I know Bob Tracy will do aseptic swabbing and then run a scorpion on those to test for the presence of microbes after the sanitation practice. And we often provide clients who will come in and ask for some swabs and saline so they can swab facilities, and then they bring them in and we run the scorpion for them. So now that we've talked about, that's really the meat and potatoes of the sanitation process, but I wanted to talk a little bit about where we find microbes and some problem areas. And so wine spoilage microbes come in from the very beginning, on the grapes. The very first time you pick into picking bins, they're probably pretty clean. They've been sitting dry all season, off season. But I'd say by the end of the first day, your picking bins are contaminated. The grape processing equipment, usually the very first day of crush, everything is nice and clean. It's been thoroughly sanitized. By the end of the day, everything is got microbes growing on it, because all day long there's juice on it. Even if you're rinsing it, there's juice, there's air, there's warmth, and there's microbes. So grape processing equipment. If you do natural fermentations, you don't do any inoculated fermentations, everything is not inoculated, you often find that the very first fermentations go very slowly and they take a while to get going. And that's because you did a really good job sanitizing your grape processing equipment off season. But then as you continue during harvest, you notice that the fermentations really start to get going. Well, that's simply a lack of sanitation. Okay, so I'm not saying that if you want to do native fermentations, you should be lax on sanitation, but that's generally what happens. They're in pumps and hoses, obviously, tanks and barrels. All these places are sources of spoilage microbes. And finally, even if you do everything right, if you bring in wine from another facility or from previous vintages, maybe you weren't as diligent, you're going to end up as potential sources of wine spoilage microbes. So you go into a previous vintage or wine that came in from other facility, you move it with through a hose and pump, or you go into it with a thief, and then you go into a new wine, you get contamination. So who comes in on the grapes? I think the thing here is to focus all these microbes, but look over here on the percent positive. So 70% of the juice samples that we tested at ETS have acetic acid bacteria in them. 66% have Zygosaccharomyces, 76% Pichia, 81% Hansenia spora. You get very low levels of Brettanomyces and lower levels of Pedio and Lactobacillus. But the presence of these microbes in the vineyard changes with each vintage. But the bottom line is spoilage microbes can come in on the grapes. Most often, grapes will have spoilage microbes. During cold soak for red wines, or just when you first press off white wines, you can get some spoilage occurring. You get from acetic acid bacteria, you get acetic acid. The wine the juice still has a lot of oxygen in it, and these bacteria need oxygen. And so you can get some acetic acid production or gluconic acid production. Lactic acid bacteria, they can start converting sugar into acetic acid, some of them right away. And then the wild yeast will produce ethyl acetate and acetic acid. You can get huge levels of ethyl acetate before you even start fermentation process. And of course, the wild yeast are also producing ethanol. Here's a case study. This was provided to me by Bob Tracy from BevTrack. See down in the bottom there. Bob does a lot of studies where he goes in when people have problems, and he looks and does an audit in the winery. So this particular winery, this had a fermentation that had high levels of lactobacillus in the wine, a big spike in VA, and a stuck ferment. And he found high levels of lactobacillus on crush equipment. And if you look here, these were the lactobacillus on the destemmer belt and the belt catch pan. But if you look at the yeast all through all of the equipment used for crushing and moving the wine into the tank, just all of that full of different yeast and bacteria. So once again, a real issue. You can see and just this bin had high levels. So once again, sanitation on the crush equipment. This is the first entry point for spoilage microbes into the winemaking process. During primary fermentation, acetic acid bacteria, generally we don't see that much acetic acid produced during primary fermentation from these bacteria, because once fermentation starts, the wine becomes saturated with CO2. And once again, these guys need oxygen. So very early on, yes, but once fermentation really starts moving, no. Lactic acid bacteria, they can make acetic acid from sugar. They can make biogenic amines. There's even been some indication that they can make some sulfide-like compounds. And then certainly wild yeast can make ethyl acetate and high levels of acetic acid. We'll often see big spikes in acetic acid of up to 1 gram per liter, right at about a 6 to 7% alcohol. And this is almost always associated with different Pichia species. They get stressed out as the alcohol gets to 6 or 7%, and they make and they'll rapidly create a bunch of acetic acid. Usually that's limiting though, and it stops right around 1.2 grams. Here was a case study, once again provided by Bob, where we had some Brettanomyces detected in wines during secondary fermentation. And so that's pretty early on in the process. And so trying to figure out where this came from, the wines were cellared in new oak barrels. And what he found out was, in doing his audit, that there was Brett in the must pump. So now if you have Brett in your must pump, that means anything that goes through that is you're introducing Brett into the wines during the fermentation, gives them a chance to grow. They don't compete as rapidly or grow as rapidly or compete with the Saccharomyces, but they're there and they're increasing in number. He also detected it in a drain where the same room where the fermentation tanks were located. And of course, Brett in the winery environment has been shown to be transferred by fruit flies. So once again, Brett in the facility, both infrastructure and in equipment, and they end up with brand new oak barrels with Brett in them and Brett in the wine. So once again, lack of sanitation. During malolactic fermentation, what can you see occur? Lactic acid bacteria can produce a lot of acetic acid, biogenic means, mousy, we talked about mousy, that corn chip type taste, aroma, and diacetyl can occur during malolactic fermentation. Often these things occur towards the end of malolactic fermentation. And then from yeast, if the yeast are stressed out and still in contact, you can get sulfides and aldehydes produced during ML. During barrel aging is a place where we have a lot of issues with spoilage. So if you get all the way through fermentation and malolactic fermentation, you're doing a really good job. And then you can have spoilage occur in the barrel. Once again, it's really important, and we'll talk about this a little bit later about SO2 management, but also topping, okay? Not allowing a lot of headspace and oxygen on the surface of the wine in your barrel. If you do, you're going to get acetic acid produced and ethyl acetate produced from acetic acid bacteria. Lactic acid bacteria, if there's any sugar left, they'll make acetic acid. They can make biogenic amines. Mousy, although usually in my experience, mousy is always more often shows up at the end of malolactic fermentation. And then Brettanomyces, of course, is the biggest issue. Generally, acetic acid production by Brettanomyces is associated with high oxygen, so it doesn't occur that often, but certainly the volatile phenols, the isovaleric acid, which is like a rancid oil or rancid cheese. These are the compounds that are produced by Brett during barrel aging. So we really have to be diligent during barrel aging, and that means monitoring, topping, good SO2. One of the things that I always throw this in there when we talk about barrels and wood is that barrels are a major source of microbial contamination. You look at the wood structure, if you look at it through a microscope, it's just a mass of small tubes, okay? And that's what the wood structure is. And if you've ever cut a barrel stave in half, you can see that wine easily can stain at least 8 millimeters into the wood. And if the wine can get that far into the wood, then microbes can get that far into the wood. So if the wine is moving into the wood and carrying microbes into the wood, then it's very difficult to sterilize this subsurface wood. You just, things like hot water or ozone, they get the stuff right on the surface, but they don't get the stuff in here. And that's why we generally recommend steam for cleaning barrels, as it is able to penetrate all the way in, as hot as you can get it. And then barrels, at least new barrels, have a lot of wood sugars depending on the toast level, and these are particularly a good nutrient source and for something like Brettanomyces. Okay, they love these wood sugars. So let's say you get all the way through the process. Now you've got through primary fermentation, malolactic fermentation, all the way through barrel aging, and you've made a beautiful wine. Okay, and it's something that would get a 100 score from the Wine Spectator. And then you put it in the bottle. And then if it goes bad, all that work, everything you did to get it into the bottle was wasted. Okay, it's for nothing. And a lot of problems can occur in the bottle. We see them every day. All right. So what can cause problems in the bottle? Acetic acid bacteria. Well, yes, they can produce acetic acid, but generally that doesn't happen right away, okay? Because they need about 3.5 milligrams per liter of dissolved oxygen before they can create acetic acid. And most people are bottling well under 1 milligram per liter, and so it's not such a problem. But 20 years later, when the integrity of the cork seal is lost and the SO2 is gone, then they'll make vinegar. I always tell people it is acetic acid's bacteria's destiny to turn your wine into vinegar. Lactic acid bacteria, they can make acetic acid and biogenic amines, but generally if you've got good SO2, good molecular SO2, and there's no sugar, then they're really not too much of a concern. Brettanomyces, they proliferate in the barrel, okay? The two things I see, excuse me, in the bottle, the two things I see proliferate in bottles or bloom in bottles are Pediococcus and Brettanomyces. They don't, and this occurs even in the absence of any fermentable sugar. Once again, high pH wines, low SO2, these are particular problems. And last but not least, if you have any sugar in your wine, then fermentation positive yeast like Saccharomyces or Zygosaccharomyces, huge problem. Okay, and we see this every week. We have wines coming in, whether it's bottles pushing corks, bagging the boxes that are inflated, cans exploding off the top lid. So fermentation positive yeast, you only need one if you've got sugar. Okay, so these are all problems that can occur in the bottle. So we want to look at just one case study from Bob, and this is one where Zygosac, and Acetobacter were detected in bottled products. Now, the Acetobacter maybe not such an issue initially, okay, but these wines were filtered, 0.45 micron absolute filter, membrane filter during bottling, or I should say prior to the bottling line. And then when he did a survey, these same microbes were detected on the bottling equipment. Daily hot water sanitation at startup, daily water flush at shutdown, but just hot water was used for sanitation. And once again, you can see the Sparger had, there's 231 CFU of yeast. Certainly the leveler, you get Zygosac, Saccharomyces, Acetobacter on filler spouts. What we found is that the longer your bottling run, the more likely your filler spouts or filler bowls are to become contaminated, or Sparger, any place that has wine around it, the longer your bottling run, the more likely you are to have contamination. And that's why I want to briefly discuss the difference between sterile filtration and sterile packaging, because so often when we get wines that are going through a secondary fermentation in the bottle, people say, I don't know what happened. I sterile filtered the wine. And I always tell them that sterile filtration is pretty easy to do properly, but sterile packaging is not nearly as easy. Okay, so what microbes are routinely observed in sterile filtered wines? Well, we see Saccharomyces cerevisiae, we see Enococcus enii, and we see acetic acid bacteria. Now, these are the three microbes that are present in every winery. Okay, you introduce Saccharomyces cerevisiae when you inoculate, and the same thing with Enococcus if you're inoculating with ML. So these are always in a winery, and then acetic acid bacteria is everywhere, but particularly in wineries. So that's what we see. And so where do they come from? Incomplete sanitation, biofilms, and then the environment, in the air in the winery. I just had a discussion yesterday with some people who sell this product called an Aerocide, which is a NASA-designed instrument that removes some volatile organics and microbes from the air. We have them throughout ETS labs just to keep the level of microbes down and also volatile organic compounds. But in your environment, you have microbes floating around, and they land on a filler head, and then they start to grow. So anything you can do to reduce the overall load of microbes by doing thorough sanitation, removing biofilms, and reducing the environmental microbial load is going to reduce the problems of secondary fermentation due to contamination during packaging. So, another slide from Bob, just he was looking at what sites have the, in the winery have the highest frequency of wine microbes. And looking at crush equipment, he found that presses, conveyor belts, and sump pans had the highest levels. Cellar equipment, small parts, tank rack valves are just notorious. And of course, oak cooperage. Bottling equipment, for your filter inlet and outlet lines, even the interior of the filter housing is notorious for biofilms. Sparger and rinser spouts and filler spouts are contaminated. And then in the environment and infrastructure, drains, floors, walls, microbes don't persist for a long time in the infrastructure environment, but they can be moved around. Like I said, they can be vectored by fruit flies, or if you're using a high pressure hose and spraying a floor, you can then all of a sudden spray these things and they're up aerosolized in the air. So it's really important to keep things clean, but almost any place in the winery can be a source of microbes. So what are the recommended practices? What we say, minimize the load of spoilage microbes in your facility. Screen for the presence of spoilage microbes to make sure that you are doing a good job with sanitation. I mean, sanitation done properly should minimize that load of spoilage microbes, but you need to check. You can't just say, okay, we've sanitized. Certainly during the winemaking practice, SO2 management. And then you got to think about things from a microbial perspective. I always tell people, be the microbe, because certainly when you're trying to assess risk at certain times during the manufacturing process, the winemaking process, there are times when, depending on the presence of specific microbes, there's a great risk, and other times that same microbe might represent a very small risk. The example for that would be during barrel aging. If you have a high level of Acetobacter, that's a big problem. But if you're going to bottle and you've got good SO2 and a good closure, then Acetobacter is not so much of an issue. So let's look at this. How do we minimize spoilage microbes in your facility? Everything we just talked about so far today. Sanitation. Okay, if you're bringing used barrels into your facility, check them. Okay, call me and I'll tell you how we generally recommend to check used barrels. Clean and check condition of equipment. You'd be surprised that as hoses get older, you get small cracks in those hoses. And when you bend a hose one way, you've got cracks opening up on one side and closed on the other, and you bend it back the other way and you get just the opposite. So depending on the orientation when you're doing sanitation of your hoses, if you don't move your hoses around when you're sanitizing them and open up all those cracks to sanitize it, you can have some problems. Okay, and same thing with pumps. There and any place where you've got equipment and you've got a potential dead end in it, you've got to make sure it's cleaned, and you have to check the condition of sanitation. If you're bringing wine into your facility, check it. Make sure you're not bringing in something with a high load. Now, once again, I have clients who have a zero tolerance for any spoilage microbes on wine coming into their facility. And sometimes that's maybe going a little bit overboard because they already have some of these in their facility. But certainly you don't want to bring in a wine that's got really high numbers of Brett or PDO or lactobacillus. So check incoming wine, and then reduce the airborne load. And like I said, there are a lot of different air filtration systems out there, but if you can reduce the number of microbes floating around, you'll be better off. So what do we say as far as one of those recommended practices is screening? So we say, if you've got a microscope, you can do microscopy, looking at rinses from different surfaces, looking at wine at different stages. You can do direct plating or filtration plating, or you can run scorpions. Okay, send them in for scorpions. But the idea is, if you're doing sanitation, take the time to check and verify that you're doing a good job. And once again, Bob Tracy offers this service where he comes out and he'll do the audit right there, the assessment right in your facility. Effective use of SO2. And SO2 is not really a sanitation agent, so to speak, but it does repress growth. So if you are using SO2 effectively, you're not going to have large populations of microbes in your wine. And therefore, when your wine touches a pump or a hose or anything in your winery, it's not going to leave a lot of microbes. So it is an important part in overall winery sanitation. So people want to know, what is the optimal molecular SO2? Well, the optimal molecular SO2 is as high as you can go. Unfortunately, it's one of these things where you can't always achieve optimal molecular SO2 with high pH wines, but it's all about SO2 management, and that's once again another tool we use to minimize microbial load in the winery. So how much SO2? Well, it's kind of there's a balance between protecting against microbial growth and then sensory impact. So people ask me, what's the optimal amount? And I say, maintain the highest level of molecular SO2 possible without causing a negative sensory impact. And if you've got a high pH, it's possible that you can't reach an SO2 level high enough to prevent microbial growth. And we like to say that, if you're below 0.3 molecular and get down to 0.1 molecular, you're not really controlling growth. Between 0.3 and 0.5, depending on the organism, you're repressing. And generally, once you get over 0.5, except for some, say, SO2 tolerant strains of Brett, you're going to do a pretty good job on preventing growth, whether in the bottle or in the barrel. So molecular SO2. Something that's interesting, and I've been asking this question a lot lately of winemakers is, do you know what the rate of free SO2 loss is in your bottles after you bottle the wine? You know how much the SO2 drops after 6 months? How much does the SO2 drop after a year? I generally hear crickets. There's no response. And it's amazing how many people don't look at this. And this is really important. You should know what your SO2 levels are 6 months after bottling. And the reason for that is many people will hold a red wine for 6 months before releasing, or maybe even longer. So at the time you release the wine, you want it to have the highest level of molecular SO2 possible without causing a negative sensory impact. Okay, not when you bottle, but at the time you release. So it's an important thing to know how much SO2 you lose between the time you bottle and the time you release the wine. And I'll get off that soapbox and just continue on. But once again, very few people check that. So free SO2 maintenance during barrel aging. Suppose this is our target, and I don't know, let's just say it's 35 milligrams per liter of free SO2. A lot of times people will just add SO2 and, they'll wait, a few months and add it again when they top. They're not really maintaining, or they're not topping as often, not adding SO2 as often. And what happens is you get these big valleys down here where you really have relatively low SO2. And then when you add the SO2, a lot of it is bound up. So we see this type of an action in a wine that is made in this process. That's not, say, a reductive process where you're embracing maybe oxygen contact with the wine and on the surface of the wine. Wines made in this style, generally at the time of bottling, have a pretty high level of total SO2 in relation to free SO2. So you'll see a ratio of 5 to 1 or 8 to 1 or 10 to 1 total to free. Now, on the other hand, if you top and add SO2 more frequently, but you're adding smaller amounts of SO2, you maintain your overall SO2 levels. They don't drop. You don't have as much acetaldehyde production. You don't have as much microbial growth. And generally, people who do this, when they get ready to bottle, their total sulfur to free sulfur ratios are more like 2 to 1 or 3 to 1. Okay, so once again, I have clients who feel if they have to put more than 150 mils of wine into a barrel when they're topping, that they have to increase the frequency. Okay, they've got to top more often, because anything more than 150 mils is providing too much surface area for acetaldehyde production, for acetic acid bacteria growth. But once again, I don't tell people how to make wine or what style they should make, but just the more you maintain an adequate SO2 level during aging, the fewer microbial problems you'll have, the less amount of microbial growth that'll occur. And then lastly, it's just important to think about what's going on in the wine and where you are in the process in regards to sanitation from the microbial perspective. Microbes look at things as either things that help them grow or things that inhibit them. So sugar, malic acid, nitrogen, all these things are things that microbes need to grow. If you've got sugar present in a wine or malic acid present in a wine, it's at much greater risk for things growing than if you don't have any sugar or malic acid, okay? And likewise, when we look at growth inhibitors, these are things that prevent the microbes from growing. Good molecular SO2, the higher the ethanol, that's helpful. Low pH is helpful. Lack of nutrients, although I'll tell you it's rare to ever really see a lack of nutrients in a wine. But the bottom line is, if these things are absent, as far as nutrients, or you've got high levels of SO2 or ethanol, it's going to be harder for things to grow. And so when you're looking at your winemaking process, you have to identify places where microbes can proliferate, which creates a sanitation issue, because now anything that wine touches will cause contamination. So it's always good to keep this in mind during the process. So once you've done everything to reduce microbial loads and improve your sanitation practices, how do you know if it's worked? Well, I'd suggest you can either do swabs or send wines in for testing or whatever. Bob Tracy will come out and do an assessment. And this is some data where he's showing in these blue bars are various places in the winery, rack and bottom valves, walls, floors, fittings, hoses, pumps, cooperage, and looking at levels with the initial assessment. And then once you implement this sanitation protocols, you have much lower levels of microbes. So it does work. And once again, sanitation is critical to reducing microbial load, to reducing spoilage, and of course, to maintaining the quality of your wine. So conclusions. Initial sanitation assessments show that ineffective sanitation practices lead to high microbial loads on equipment and in the winery environment or infrastructure. So if you're not doing a good job sanitizing, you're going to have microbes everywhere. And they've also found that wine spoilage microbes are more frequently present at specific assessment sites. So once again, he's talking about tank valves, hoses, pumps, in the bottling line, filler heads, sparging heads. So there's a lot of places that things will show up if you're not doing a good job with sanitation. I don't like to use the term wine quality because that's very subjective, but the fact is, overall, you can be pretty certain if you have ineffective sanitation practices, your wine's not going to be as good as it could be. And finally, improved sanitation practices lead to decreases in microbial loads, decreases in frequency of microbes detected, decreased wine remediation activities, that's a cost saving. And then lastly, understanding the risk associated with specific microbes at individual points in the winemaking process is really key to preventing spoilage. So it's not just make sure everything is sanitized and clean, but also understanding at what points in your winemaking process you are at the highest risk for microbes growing and causing a problem. So with all of that together, you can certainly implement a sanitation program and greatly reduce or even eliminate the occurrence of spoilage in the winery. And that's the point. So with that, I'll just say thank you for coming. I think I only went a minute over, so that's pretty good with all the material I put out there. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take any questions. Or at the same time, I believe this is being recorded, or if you just want a hard copy of this presentation, you can just send an email request to connect@etslabs.com. And certainly Madison will have that information in case you forget it, but you can get a hard copy of this and you can go through it at your own pace. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rich. This is fantastic information and appreciate you sharing your insights on this. I know this topic is so important, especially going into harvest. So I hope all of our members that were able to tune in today and those who will be able to watch the recording really get something out of it, because there's a lot of really great information. So I just want to thank you again for presenting today and participating.
Sure.
And yeah, we look forward to a very successful harvest, and hopefully all of our members take these sanitation practices to heart and really make it a successful year. So
we're hoping for an uneventful harvest.
Exactly.
Right? So everyone have a great harvest. And like I said, any questions, I'm easy to find. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Rich.
Okay, bye now.